Welcome to lecture 23 in anthropology. We'll be talking about the question of race and racism, racial identity. Today we're being joined by Franklin, who has insisted that I hold him while I record this lecture. So let's take a look at race by asking ourselves a really important question. When did you first become aware of different races? The idea that people were different. Psychologists note that we are wired to notice differences, but then again, how we interpret those differences and what we do about them is up to us and is a product of our training, our education, and our experiences. So we might be wired to see difference, but it's our choice to do something about it. Let's start first with two terms that might be easily confused: race and then ethnicity. Race is a socially constructed phenomenon. So it's a belief that people with certain physical characteristics, like their skin color or their hair texture, are somehow biologically different from other people who don't have that same hair or that same skin color. Though biologically speaking, there are no races. Biology recognizes no race as a concept. All of us humans are Homo sapiens sapiens. So race is very real, even though it is actually not biologically real. We believe it's real. We treat it as real, but it has no basis in biology. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is a category to describe a group of people who have a culture that they share, a history that they share, so that their language and their religions and values and group norms and traditions are shared over time and mark them as an ethnic group. Ethnic groups are real, but notice that the word ethnicity is not situated in biology. It has no biological basis for it. Rather, in fact, it's culture. Because of the existence of race and racism, many groups in societies around the world are minorities. And minority can have two definitions. It could be mathematical, as in you are actually a smaller group by numbers, but it also can be a cultural definition. The way we're going to use minority in terms of race is a group who is not necessarily a numerical minority. In fact, they may actually be roughly equal to the majority. But these folks who share some kind of physical or cultural characteristic are denied power, and they're denied the resources that go to the majority. And over time, we see that this minority group has fewer rights, it has fewer privileges, and it has fewer opportunities. A good example might be women. In many societies, women are often roughly equivalent to males, numerically speaking, but may not have the same access to power or resources that men do. So keep in mind, the discussion of minorities really for us will revolve not around the number, like how many of you are there, but on your access to power, privilege, and resources. When we talk about race and racism, at the core of the issue is really two things: how we think about other people, and then how we act towards other people. There are two ways of thinking One is called prejudice, which, if you find this helpful, literally it means to prejudge. So to judge someone beforehand. And what you're judging them on is their imagined characteristics or their real characteristics as part of a group. So I don't know you, but I know all people like you are, and then I oppose a judgment. Prejudice is typically negative. So a prejudicial attitude to prejudge someone on their characteristics generally assumes that those characteristics are bad or their group membership is bad. There's also the concept of stereotype. And a stereotype is also a form of thinking in which you use an exaggerated description to apply to every person who belongs in a category. All women are, all South Koreans are, all Hispanic people X, Y, and Z. So whatever the characteristic is, you apply it to every person in that group, and very often that characteristic is exaggerated in some way so that the group, I see I've been abandoned, so that the group membership is assumed to be the same for everybody in that group. Stereotypes can be positive or negative. So you can have a negative stereotype of someone, not based in reality. You can also have a positive stereotype of a group of people, such as all Asians are good at math, which is a positive view of Asians, but also not accurate, since it's an exaggerated description of a category of people. And then finally, if you act on either of these, you're guilty of discrimination. Discrimination is when you treat people unfairly because of their group membership. So I will treat you differently based on what group I perceive you to be a part of. So we've got three ways that we can think about our actions and our thoughts with regards to other people's differences. We can have prejudicial judgments of them, we can prejudge them, we can stereotype them, and we can discriminate against them. Now, if you can combine these with the concept of a minority, we get our next concept. Racism. Racism, as one scholar has said, is prejudice plus power. So I prejudge you, but I also have the power to make you an inferior in my society and in my world. Racism is grounded in the view that certain groups of people, ethnic or racial groups, are somehow biologically inferior, culturally inferior. In some, they are less than the group to which you belong if you are a racist. You can have racist ideas and policies and actions that are the result of individuals. So an individual can engage in personal individual racism, but you can also have an entire society engage in racism or racialized behavior and thinking. The ism on the end does have an implication that racism is much more than just a single act of prejudice against somebody you don't like. It's a systemic, a widespread view of a group that you see embedded in how the law treats that group, how that group is treated socially, what policies affect that group, and even the institutions to which that group can be a member or denied membership. Some really good examples from American history would be the period of Jim Crow. Between the end of the Civil War, 1880s or so, to the 1960s, It was generally accepted that African Americans could occupy a second-class citizenship in America, and that second-class citizenship could be embedded in law, so that Black Americans wouldn't get the same level of justice in courts. Social practices requiring segregation of African Americans, institutions like churches and schools practicing segregation. So this racism that appeared in Jim Crow was a systemic racism in which their entire society and individuals reinforce the second-class status of African Americans. And in the world of racism, the majority gets a privilege that's denied to the minority. Very often that majority tells itself that that privilege is right, natural, or just because they're superior and the minority is inferior. As Martin Luther King Jr. once said, these privileges come in the form of laws that majorities make minorities obey, but then don't make the majority obey the law. It's a rule for you, but not for me. So the question is, in America in 2020 or in recent years, does racism exist? How do we know it exists? So I threw together some examples picking African Americans, but I could have picked any other minority group in the United States and shown you some examples. And the way we look at this question of how we know racism exists is we look for statistical evidence that there is a difference. And that difference is not tied to some kind of individual behavior. That is, it can't be explained by the actions of an individual. So we're going to assume that if every group in American society were relatively equal, that is, we were all on the same level playing field, then no group would have a dramatically different status in our society. But I can show you these statistics. Black families in the United States earn $57.50 for every $100 earned by white families. If the two were relatively equal, the incomes would be closer together and not far apart. African Americans are 2 times more likely to be unemployed. Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended from school as whites, even when they've broken the rule in the same way. African Americans are 13% of the US population, but 40% of people in prison are Black Americans. Black homeowners, about 42% of the group in the United States, but white ownership is about 72% of that group in the United States. If our society was closer to equality, those two numbers should be closer together. Black drivers are 30% more likely than whites to be pulled over while driving. Black children are more likely to grow up in poverty than any other group in the United States. If our society were relatively equal, these differences would not exist. And so statistically, we say they cannot be the result of random chance. It cannot be random that this group experiences these differences. And if it's not random, it must be racism. So how do we explain racism? If this exists and racism is part of American society, how do we figure out what caused it? There are lots of theories. Some are psychological, some are anthropological, some are political. The theories all work together in some way, but sometimes some of them are better explaining racism than others. One older theory is the frustration aggression hypothesis, that people who don't get what they want in a society shift their frustration to others. So they scapegoat a group as, say, for example, Nazis scapegoated Jews in the 1930s in Germany. This, in psychological terms, is a form of displacement. I am angry about a situation, and I have to act my anger out on a weaker group of people that can't defend themselves. The problem, of course, with this frustration aggression hypothesis is it doesn't explain why racism persists for certain groups versus others. Why, for example, isn't the United States flipped so that whites are the object of black frustration aggression? And of course, so we have to look at other theories to help explain that. A similar theory is conflict theory that says racism is justified by groups because they're pursuing resources that a group wants. So essentially, this is jealousy. I want what you have. I'm going to take it. I'll feel better about it by convincing myself that you're inferior. This does particularly work well for instances of war and conflict around the world. Another theory is that racism is the product of an elite group within a society. And that elite group wants to maintain their elite status. So they encourage poor people to hate other races instead of the elites. So if I'm rich and powerful, rather than risk you hating me, I will stir up racism so you hate some other group instead. The idea here is the wealthy are able to get displacement of anxiety and displacement of jealousy onto a hated racial group so that the wealthy then can remain in power. These origins of racism are all economic in nature. That is, it's about control, it's about access to resources, it's about maintaining one's power status. But these aren't the only way you can explain race and racism. You can also explain it psychologically. For example, psychologists have noted that people with authoritarian personalities are far more likely to engage in racist behavior, racist language. Because authoritarians value conformity, submission to authority, they have high intolerance of other people, deep insecurities, superstitious thinking, and very rigid thinking, they tend not to welcome or embrace diversity. They don't like difference. Difference heightens their insecurity, and that makes them feel anxious. So authoritarians typically will appeal to racism and racist ideas and racist thinking. Another psychological / social psychological explanation is that racism originates with the lack of contact with other people who are different. And there's quite a bit of support for this idea that when we encounter people who are different from us and learn to work with them and come to embrace and understand them, it does tend to lessen racist thinking and racial ideology and discrimination. So isolation from other groups can promote an us versus them thinking, because you don't know them, you don't know anything about them, you don't have a personal connection to them. And that can be very much a factor in you thinking, I just don't like this group of people. There is a theory that extends that even further to say that this us versus them thinking has a function of promoting group bonds. Group bonds, or the bonding in like groups or tribal thinking, creates social cohesion. And so racism can often be a function of trying to get a group of people together. Let's all hate the insert name of group, because it pulls us together as a group of people much more. So all of these different explanations for racism on this slide happen to do with personality and psychology and social psychology. The reaction to racism by minorities and victims of racism are varied. So you might think that people who are victimized by racism would react the same way, and it turns out they don't. For one thing, some people who are experiencing racism and prejudice and discrimination assimilate, and they try to pass as the dominant culture if they can pass as the dominant culture. So they might adopt characteristics, values, traits, language, clothing styles, something that makes them look like the dominant culture. So, for example, if you recall when we talked about the Ebonics controversy of the 1990s in our unit on language, you might remember that many people recommended that Black children be taught middle class English norms. That way they could pass as educated. And of course, the assumption there was if they spoke their Afro-American vernacular, they were seen as unintelligent. When in fact, AAVE has its own syntax and grammar. It's a fully functioning language. So the idea there is if I can pull off a cultural marker of intelligence, I can pass for your dominant culture. So you might see this in clothing, where someone in the minority culture might change their clothes in order to show up for a job interview so they can appear to fit the majority culture. They might change their hairstyles, they might change their name, they might change their overt behaviors so they can be accepted. In fact, even skin color was attempted to be changed by African Americans in the 20th century. African Americans who wanted to pass as white sometimes resorted to bleaching and other chemical means in order to lighten their skin. The assumption being that lighter put you closer to the dominant culture. Many people have to practice the art of code switching to fit in. So they live in the dominant culture, maybe at work during the day, and then they switch to their own personal culture in the evening at night or when they're with friends and they relax. So you almost end up with two different identities that you're constantly negotiating throughout your day. Code switching can be exhausting for people to remember of, I have to act a certain way in front of this group. I have to pretend so that I can fit in. Another response might be acceptance and even an embracing of racist thinking and racist ideas. We even see this among minority groups. Minority groups will internalize the racism and apply it to themselves or apply it to others like them. So, for example, African Americans who might utilize the language of describing other Black people as thugs in order to justify, how they're viewed or treated by the police, are in fact adopting an internalized racism, which they don't apply to themselves because they don't label themselves as a thug, but someone who is not like them could get that label. You might end up applying some of this racism to yourself, as in the 1950s Clark-Doll test, where it showed psychologically that Black children had assumed that they were inferior as opposed to white children. They associated Black skin as being less than and not as important as white skin, which was happy and valued. So it's quite possible to internalize an ism on yourself and repress your own culture. You could try to avoid racism. You might withdraw from society, form an all your group community. Um, There might be quite a bit of anxiety that you hold on to as a result of doing this. We see this in the phenomenon of stereotype threat. It's the anxiety that a minority group gets when you are trying not to match a stereotype. So you're thinking, oh my God, don't do this. If I act this way, then they're going to definitely think I'm whatever this minority stereotype is. And so constantly you're worried that you fit the stereotypical view of your group. And that creates quite a bit of anxiety that ends up causing you to avoid social situations. It leads to lowered performance on the job, lowered performance on tests. There is also the possibility of aggression. Minority groups might react with anger, and that could be a displaced anger or a direct anger or an indirect anger. Um, um, on maybe even one of their own community because they recognize that they're trapped in a system that sees them as less capable, less powerful, less worthy. So it's quite possible to see aggression as a reaction to being trapped in a system that treats you differently than the majority culture. That has been our quick intro to racism. We will look more at these questions, particularly in the next lecture, taking a look at the Egyptians' view of themselves and the question of race in ancient Egypt.